Hi, friends. Environmental economics is the course which I am going to present to all my dear students here. What concepts we are going to study in this environmental economics, they are highlighted on the slide. I would be spending a lot of time discussing these concepts, but let me just list those things here. So, my course on environmental economics would deal with all the important concepts which are generally taught to the students in this environmental course. Uh, the first concept which I would be dealing with and explaining you is what are externalities. Externalities would be discussed at quite a length in the context of what is typically known as market failure. So, the first topic which we will be covering in this course on environmental economics is the concept of externalities, and both the positive externalities and negative externalities will be discussed at length with lot many examples. An interesting concept of market equilibrium and how it shifts when you take into consideration the environmental externalities, that would be explained to you with the help of some neat diagrams. Pigovian taxes and Pigovian subsidies. These are the two interventions which government does to make sure that the environment is taken care of. So, what are Pigovian taxes? When are they applied? What are Pigovian subsidies? When are they applied? And how are they relevant to environmental economics, that we will be understanding in detail in my course on environmental economics. Along with the market based approach of subsidies and taxes, we would also look into some approaches which government generally follows for taking care of environmental externalities, and those approaches are known as command and control approaches. So, what are command and control approaches? That would be discussed with help of some good examples. Finally, an interesting concept which is debated a lot in environmental economics and which is called as Coase theorem would be taken up. Coase theorem was proposed by Ronald Coase, and it is an interesting theorem which which comes from a firm believer of what is free market. So, what this Coase theorem is about, how it looks at the environmental externalities, that would be discussed at length, and we would also be discussing the limitations of this Coase theorem when we have to address the environmental problems. It would be uh, injustice to this course of environmental economics if we don't look into the pressing issues which we are facing today. The most pressing issue of environment is the climate change and pollution. So climate change and pollution, they are being addressed by the government by what is known as carbon tax, and we would look into this carbon tax phenomena in much detail with the help of lot many examples from across the world. We would also look into a more market based mechanism for tackling this fossil fuel based emissions and what is known as cap and trade or emission trading concept, and how it is different slightly from a carbon tax concept. And we would also relate both these things, that is the carbon tax and cap and trade, to the concepts which we had earlier studied. So, all in all, this environmental economics would be a fun because we have so many interesting concepts to study, which generally is always taught in all the universities around the world. I hope that this introductory course of environmental economics would be triggering an interest in you, and this course would really be a fun learning. Thank you. Friends, let us understand this concept of externalities again. Uh, Externalities we had been discussing in the last lecture, I wanted to propose a new way of looking at externalities. In a market economy, what is assumed is there are buyers and sellers who would exchange their goods based on the supply and demand, right? So there's a voluntary exchange between the buyers and sellers, and they would exchange the goods depending upon the supply and demand forces. That's the fundamental way of thinking a market economy. The point is, what would happen, let us say, when this voluntary exchange between the buyer and seller affects a third party? It means that the third party is neither the buyer nor the seller, but still it is affected. It could be positively affected or negatively affected. So it means that though there are private markets which would put the buyers and sellers together and decide what goods are to be produced, how they are to be produced, and who gets them, but still the third party is not the stakeholder in that. So the third party, when it is affected in this way, we got to have some other concept to explain this, because the third party is not the one who is producing the good. The third party is not for whom the good is being produced, or third party is not the one who is getting the goods. It is unaffected by the fact that it is neither the buyer nor the seller, but still it gets affected because of some other reason, not because of the fact that the third party is a buyer or seller. The other reason could be an environmental reason, and if that is the environmental reason, it is called as environmental externality. So externalities, if I want to define from that perspective, it is to quantify that the people who are not directly involved in the transaction, okay, they, if affected in a larger way, we have to call them as an externality, right? So in this market economy where the consumption is happening, production is happening, investment decisions are being taken, it could be taken at the individual level, at the household level, or at the company level, at the firm level, right? And when these transactions happen and the people who are not directly involved in these transactions, they are affected, those third parties, when they are affected in a major way, the economists call them as externalities, right? So this is a more fundamental way of looking at externalities. So if the effect, as I said, on the third party is negative or adverse, we call it as negative externality. If it is positive to the third party, we would call it as a positive externality, right? So this is another way of thinking of externalities, and this concept of externalities would become more clear to us when we take some concrete examples. Like, look at this. Look at these examples which I have figured it out. The exhaust coming from the automobile, the smoke coming from the cigarette, the dogs which are barking, of course, pets, the loud stereos in an apartment building, the noisy students, the neighbors' poorly maintained property. Now, if you look at all these things, you would find that, for example, the first example of automobile exhaust, you might see that the consumer of automobile and the producer of automobile, right, they are the stakeholders. One is the buyer, another is the seller. But the third party, the people who would inhale that exhaust gases, they would be adversely affected. The society would be adversely affected. So it's the example of negative externality. The person who smokes cigar and the company, tobacco company, they are the stakeholders, but the people around who are getting affected because of this passive smoking, that is again an example of negative externality. One keep pets for protection of households, right? But it might also affect the other society people. Students, noisy students, or poorly maintained property, similarly, can be an example of negative externality. So, negative externality is a spillover cost to the third party, because we are talking about economics, so we need to talk about in terms of money. So, if I want to quantify that negative externality in terms of money, or define it in terms of money, it could be defined as it is a spillover cost to the third party, and these costs are borne by the society, they are borne by the third party. This is the negative externality. And one can also figure out what are positive externality, because then it is a spillover benefit to the society. And in this case, when there is a spillover benefit and the people who are benefiting, they are not paying for that, that is becomes a positive externality. For example, one might think of the health programs initiated by government, or educational programs initiated by government, or subsidized bike, subsidized renewable energy, public libraries, museums, galleries, midday meals, free school meals, nutritional advice, all this. And we would be discussing this in quite a detail why they are positive externalities. But we can think of that this, in this, not simply the stakeholders, that is the one who is benefiting from the health program and the government which is providing the health service, it's not that them who are benefiting, it is also the society at large which is benefiting. By education, it is not simply the student and the school which is being benefited, it is the entire society which gets benefited, because the citizens of that particular town or the community would be more educated. Likewise, if you talk about subsidizing bike, one might be benefited from environmental perspective, the society would be benefited from environmental perspective. So all this, they do help understand this concept of externalities in a much better way. Once we have understood this, we would now take much more concrete examples and explore this concept of externalities further in my next lecture. Thank you very much. Hello friends, I would like to discuss some more examples of positive externalities. We said that positive externalities are spillover benefits to the society, spillover benefits to the third party who are not the stakeholders, right? So, what can we think of as an example of positive externality? So, let us consider this case where there is a private company. This private company is doing some research on vaccines, right? And the vaccines are being produced, and the vaccines would ultimately would be sold to the consumers who can afford those vaccines at a private cost, right? So the consumers who would be purchasing those vaccines, they would be because that would build up their immunity. The way the vaccines operate, you all understand that if the vaccination is spread over to a larger population, as we had seen during pandemic, COVID pandemic, we know that if more and more people are vaccinated, the benefit is more. It means that there is, in a way, more more protection to the general society for that disease, right? So the social benefit would be much more than the private benefit in this case. Uh, or in other words, if left to the market forces, only a small number of society, a small number of people would be benefited by vaccination, uh, if and they would, because they would be the ones who would be affording that vaccines, right? But considering that vaccination has also a spillover effect, it is also going to affect the people who are not vaccinated, and their healthcare costs would come down. We generally say that there is additional benefit than the private benefit. So that additional benefit, if you add to the private benefit, that becomes the social benefit, right? So in case of positive externalities, the social benefit is always greater than the private benefit. If you want to understand this in terms of marginal benefit concept, marginal costing concept, we would say that if I am a private company and I am manufacturing 100 vaccines, then to manufacture an additional 101th vaccine, the cost to me would be the private marginal cost. Similarly, if those 100 vaccines reach the consumers, if a 101th consumer has to receive that vaccine, then we would say that that is an additional private cost to that consumer if he has to purchase that, right? If by some other way we make sure that the 101th consumer is not paying but the society is paying for that, then that becomes the marginal social benefit. Okay, so this is the way we look at the marginal private benefit and marginal social benefit in case of positive externality. uh, as we had said that R&D, when you had talked about external externalities, we said that research and development adds to the general body of knowledge, which contributes to the other discoveries, other developments, and also the R&D is going to help the general society at large. Okay. Another example of positive externalities is promotion of solar photovoltaic electricity. We all know that if there is a factory which produces solar PV panels, then the solar PV panels, when they are used by the consumers, that would displace the fossil fuel based electricity. For example, if in a country like India or China, people are using more of a coal based electricity, and that if it is, and that not if it is actually impacting adversely on the climate change. So the intervention could be that there has to be a promotion of solar PV, right? So if you simply look at from the private benefit perspective, then solar PV, those who are able to buy the solar PV, right, they would purchase the solar PV from the market. But because the solar PV technology has a positive externality, it benefits the climate, right, and it benefits the society at large. We can say that this has a positive externality, and hence the social benefit would be greater than the private benefit. Some more examples like having a private parks, right? Private parks, even if the park is private, if it is not a publicly available space, but one might think that if there is a private park around, the residents of the residents staying around, they would benefit from clean air, much more peace, right? Fresh air, the beautiful environment. All this would be a benefit to the neighbors who are staying around the private park, right? So even when the parks are private and they are not public, but if they are kept in a neighborhood, the neighbors who are not paying for that private park would be benefited from that. So that is what it means, that the third party is additionally benefited over and above the parties who are the stakeholders. So the social benefit is clearly greater than the private benefit. Same applies to education. Education would so help the society at large, and it is not simply the students who are going to benefit from education, especially higher education. It would be the society who would be benefiting more, and that is how we can say that the social benefit is greater than private benefit. And finally, let us look at a few more examples of externalities, especially the negative externalities. What you see over here is a power plant, and this is a coal based power plant. Uh, in a coal based power plant, there are two stakeholders. One is the coal industry, which produces electricity, and other are the consumers who consume those electricity. However, we all know that there is a third party which might be adversely affected because of a power plant. So, what is that third party? One can think of the local population, some people living around that power plant, and they might be affected adversely because of the fly ash, because of the smoke which is emitted from the power plant. So, that polluting environment of the power plant is adversely affecting the health of the people around it, maybe the fields of the farmers which are sowing the some crops over there, right? The residents who are living in their houses, all those could be affected. So that cost is not borne by the power industry, neither is it borne by the consumers. But if, let us think of it this way, that if the industry, the coal industry or the consumers are required to pay for the damages which are caused to the local population, or at a larger scale, the damage which might result because of, let us say, the emissions causing climate change, then that cost, when added to the private cost, becomes the social cost. So the social cost would be different than the private cost if the cost of negative externality is added to it. So that is the meaning of social cost being greater than private cost in case of negative externalities. Uh, and why and how do you compute that cost? This computation of this cost is really uh, a detailed and challenging task, because that might need a lot of data. Like, for example, what would be the increase in the healthcare cost because of pollution, or what are the foregone production opportunities for the farmers, or could be that there are some hotels around that power plant, but because of the pollution, the tourism would be adversely affected. All these things. So all these are indirect costs, and this indirect cost, if you compute and add to the private cost, that becomes the social cost. Another example of negative externality is a traffic congestion. We know that traffic congestion affects not only the drivers which are caught in the traffic, it affects the third party. And how does it affect the third party? It affects the third party because there would be an increase in travel time, or there could be more possibilities of traffic accidents. There could be an increase in fuel consumption because the vehicles would be idling, and there could also be an environmental pollution because of congestion, right? And this costs, which are borne by the society, they could be called as the negative externality. And these negative externalities costs are not borne by the stakeholders here, right? So how do you compute that? So if you want to compute the negative externality cost because of traffic congestion, one might have to include, say, the cost of traffic police, the hospital cost for accident cases, maybe the pollution related health costs, or at a broader level, the climate change impact costs. Okay, so all these things, if you could compute and quantify, then that becomes the cost because of negative externality. And if it is added to the private cost, we would get the social cost because of traffic, including the traffic congestion for traveling in a city. Another example could be a nuclear power plant, because if there is a purely a voluntary exchange between a consumer and a nuclear power producer, then in that case the third party is neglected. But if you consider the third party could be the passive society, which might be affected because of radioactive waste, right? And this cost, which is gone to the third party, is neither borne by the power industry nor by the consumers who might receive that electricity, right? But if, let us say, the consumers or the power industry, nuclear power industry, is made to uh, spend for the accidental deaths or the health cost from radioactivity or the cost of emergency, then that becomes the cost because of externalities. And if those are added to the private cost, that would give us the social cost. Okay. Uh, so in all the negative externality cases, we find that the cost to the society uh, is the externality, which is the spillover cost. And finally, the example of plastic bags. We know that a lot of plastic bags are being produced and being in use, right? And it is really convenient to carry goods in the plastic bags. So it has got some use, but it also has its negative side, because it might lead to environmental damage, damage to the wildlife, and so on and so forth. So this unwanted and difficult to dispose of waste in the form of plastic bags is the externality. And if you want to calculate that externality, we need to include the impact or the plastic bags are having on the environment. And if you figure this out and assign some cost to it, that becomes the cost because of negative externality. If it gets added to the private cost, that becomes your social cost. So in this way, we can look at the negative externality and think of the way of quantifying the negative externality in terms of money or costs. Thank you. Hi everybody. In this video, we would be looking into the concept of marginal costing. What is marginal cost in economics? The marginal cost is the change in the production cost which would come from producing an additional unit. Now we need to understand this very carefully. What we are saying is it is the change in the production cost, and that change comes from producing an additional unit. So there are two things: the production cost and producing at the cost of producing an additional unit. What is the production cost? We know that in production cost we need to consider two things. One is the fixed cost, and other is the variable cost. For example, if you are producing anything, that production would require some investment, and that investment is going to be there irrespective of whether you are producing the good or not. So that is called as a fixed cost, whereas the variable cost would change with respect to the output of that. It would change with respect to the quantity of goods which are produced, right? So the variable cost is going to increase when more units are being produced, right? But that is a production cost. We are not talking about simply production cost, we are talking about the marginal cost. So marginal cost means, suppose we are producing 100 units and we have figured out the production cost of that 100 units by considering the capital investment which has gone into that, and also considering the variable cost in the form of, let us say, salary of the people who are working in that unit and so on. But if you want to figure out that what additional cost the firm has to bear if it is going to produce 101 unit, right? So it is going to add one more unit. So that additional cost is called as the marginal cost, right? And how do you calculate that? So if you want to calculate the marginal cost, we need to divide the change in production cost by the change in the quantity. All right. So suppose there is a change in production cost from $100 to $110 when you are when you are producing a quantity, let us say from 50th to 51st, right? There is an increase in one. So that change, if you do that division, that would give you the marginal cost. Okay, so it's simple that way. It's a delta change in production cost per delta change in the quantity. Now, when you are talking about environmental economics, we are not simply talking about the marginal total cost. We are also interested in figuring out the cost which is borne by the society, and we had already discussed that this comes from negative externality. So, what is the marginal social cost? So, the marginal social cost would refer to the additional cost which is imposed on the society, and this would come from either the production of one unit or the production of one unit of service or some goods, or it could come from the consumption of one more unit of a good or one more unit of a service, right? So both goods and services are considered here as as products, right? So it includes the marginal social cost, include both the private costs, and it will also include the external costs of negative externalities, right? So let us consider an example as to how do you calculate the marginal social cost. Let us imagine that there is one factory, there is some firm which is producing some product, okay, widgets. So that some product, some X product it is producing. So the factory would, let us say, emit some pollution as a byproduct of its production, right? And then the private cost to the factory of producing that one more product, okay, includes, what would that include? It would include, let us say, the material cost, the energy cost, the labor cost, and so on, right? However, the production process would also generate, let us say, some pollution, and which might impact the surrounding community in terms of health, or some other form of environmental degradation, right? So that, if you have to consider, right, then we need to uh, call it as an external cost. So how do you break up that marginal social cost? So the marginal social cost would include the marginal private cost, which is basically the additional cost of producing one more product, and it would include the addition in the expenses in the form of wages, in the form of raw material, and additional cost in the energy, right? So let us say that marginal private cost of producing one more widget is $10, and we said that because of this production process, some pollution related problem would be there. Maybe there is an increase in the cost of healthcare of the individuals which are staying around, third party, or it could be the cost of cleaning up the environmental damages, or it could be the loss of biodiversity. So let us say that that comes as for producing one more widget, that one more product, that additional cost is $5. So then the marginal social cost is simply an addition of marginal private cost. In my case, it was $10, and the external cost which has to be borne, right? That becomes $5, and thus the total marginal social cost is marginal private cost plus external cost, which comes to $15. So this is how we calculate the marginal social cost. Friends, in my earlier video, I talked about marginal cost. Here we would be discussing another relevant concept in environmental economics, which is marginal benefit. Marginal cost, we talked in terms of marginal social cost and marginal private cost, which are relevant to quantify the external cost because of negative externalities. right? And we said that marginal social cost could be computed as the addition of marginal private cost and the marginal externality. Similarly, when there is a positive externality, there is a benefit to the society at large, and this benefit we need to quantify in terms of some numerical value, in terms of cash, right? So, what is this marginal benefit? A marginal benefit is the maximum amount a consumer is willing to pay for an additional good or an additional service. So it means that if it all depends on the consumer's choice, if the consumer wants the 101 good, right, then the amount he is willing to pay for that 101 good, and why would he purchase the 101 good? He might see some benefit from it, right? So that benefit which he would be accruing by purchasing the 101 good would be called as a marginal benefit, right? So the marginal benefit for a consumer has to do with the willingness to pay for an additional good or additional service. So let us understand this concept with the help of an example where I would explain you how a marginal social benefit is arrived at for a case study with a positive externality. So we had already discussed one case study with positive externality, namely installation of solar photovoltaic panels or any renewable energy for that instance. We know that by installing a solar panel, uh, it is not simply going to benefit the household, right? Because that benefit to the household would be in the form of reduced electricity bill, and that would be a private benefit, right? So when a neighborhood, when in a neighborhood where the homeowners have an option to install solar panels on their rooftops, each household that installs the solar panels benefits from reduced electricity bills, which is his private benefit, right? And we said that it's not simply that the consumer would benefit, there is an additional benefit to the community. And what would be that additional benefit? It would be in the form of reduced air pollution, right? Or a reduced reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions. So that positive externality, if you want to quantify, let us consider this. Suppose the cost of uh, a solar panel, right? Suppose a homeowner installs a solar panel system that generates, let us say, 1,000 units of electricity per year, right? And because of that, there is a saving in his electricity bill. Let us say that per unit, his or her saving is $0.15. It's per unit, per kWh. 1 unit is 1 kWh, kilowatt hours, right? Now, how much would he save? The family would save 0.15 per kWh into 1,000. So if you multiply 0.15 with 1,000, you'd get $150. And that saving is his saving, his own saving. So that becomes the private benefit. So the private benefit to the homeowner is $150. Now, what about the social benefit? So the external benefit because of the solar panels is that there will be lower emissions from the conventional power plant. Let us say that because of the solar electricity, there is a reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. Say, let us assume that about zero point 0.5 tons of carbon dioxide emissions are mitigated, they are avoided, right? So now, if we assign some cost, social cost to the carbon dioxide emissions, and let us say that that cost is some $50 per ton. So obviously, for 5.5 tons of carbon dioxide, the the benefit, the external benefit, which the household would contribute to the society would be zero point 0.5 tons into $50, which comes as $25 per year. Okay, so this is how we have calculated now the external benefit because of positive externality. So then what is the marginal social benefit in this case? So the marginal social benefit in this case would be $150 plus $25, and that becomes $175 per year, right? So this is the marginal social benefit which the family gets. Now, why is that family getting that? It is because of adding a solar panel, right? And this solar panel, when you are adding one solar panel, that is going to result in a marginal increase in social benefit, and that has is $25, whereas the marginal benefit of installing a solar PV panel was $150. So the marginal social benefit which comes from installing an additional solar panel is $175 per year. I hope that you have understood the concept of marginal social benefit, marginal social private benefit, and the positive externality quantification in terms of private benefit, private external benefit, societal external benefit, sorry. Friends, continuing with our discussion on externalities, we were discussing negative externality and positive externality, and we said that negative externality is cost to the third party, whereas positive externality is a benefit to the third party. Let us spend some more time on this concept. This concept of externalities it was introduced by Pigot in his famous book, The Economics of Welfare, and he said that there are some activities which have a cost which is greater than the private cost. So when he said that, he basically meant that there are certain costs which are not taken by the, which are not accounted for when the price is discovered in the market. So by private cost, he is referring to the cost which does not consider externalities. Whereas he uses another term, namely the social cost, which according to him would include the externalities, which would include the value of the externalities, and when that value is added to the value which is discovered in the privately in the market, those two together would be called as a social cost. For example, uh, again we take the same famous example of air pollution, and we see that there is a market mechanism acting, wherein the car industry would sell the cars to the consumers, and the consumers and the car industries, if they are not regulated, in the sense that if they are not allowed, if they don't pay for the pollution, then the cost which the consumer is buying the car from the industry, or the price at which the industry is selling the car to the consumer, we can call it as a private cost, right? But you know that when there is a sale of a car to a consumer, the car is going to pollute, and this pollution is going to impact the consumer in the form, impact the third party, not the consumer, not the producer. What could be the impact? One can think of, let us say, an extreme case where the particulate matter or soot which are coming from the exhaust gases of a vehicle, they cause some diseases like asthma or lung cancer or so on, right? So if you quantify that and you put some cost to it, a cost of treating asthma, cost of treating lung cancer, then we discover some price, and that price, if you add to the private cost, it would be called as a social cost. So left unattended, the car industry and consumer would be operating only on the private cost. But if the spillover costs of air pollution are included in the private cost, it becomes a cost which is over and above the private cost, and it is the social cost. So in case of negative externality, the social cost has to be higher than the private cost. Same thing would be applied to tobacco industry. Tobacco industry would adversely affect the third party, meaning the passive smokers, and the cost is neither borne by the tobacco industry nor by the consumers if you do not account for this negative externality, right? So the private cost would be the cost which we don't account for the adverse health impact on the passive smokers. But if you try to account for the private the impact adverse health impact on the passive smokers, the cost has to be added to the private cost, and then it becomes the social cost. So social cost again would be greater than the private cost in case of a negative externality like passive smoking. uh, there is a term which is often used, and I would spend some time on this concept, which is called as a marginal social cost and marginal private cost. Now, what this term of marginal social cost and marginal private cost means? Uh, for this, let me show you one interesting concept. Marginal, when we talk about the marginal social cost, marginal social cost means uh, a single additional single unit when it is manufactured. What would be the impact? Means, for example, if you take in a case of public transport, we all know that public transport, if it is introduced, it becomes a positive externality, and that would reduce air pollution, right? But if I want to, and I know that, so it means that the social benefit would be greater than the private benefit. But then, how many buses are to be uh, sent, or how many buses are to be sent by the depot, or how many buses are to be purchased by the depot, bus depot, in order to in order to avail the social benefits? So that decision has to be made on the marginal costs. And what does it mean? It means that mm, cost of producing an additional commodity. If I want to calculate the marginal cost of a bus, then what is the additional cost? If I have already ordered 100 buses, so it comes at certain cost. So if I want to buy additional one bus, that is 101 bus, then that cost would be a marginal cost. Okay, marginal cost. Similarly, if I take some other example, like plastic bags, right? So if, let us say that 100 plastic bags are available at a certain price, and if the manufacturer wants to produce an additional plastic bag, so the marginal private cost would be the cost of producing that additional plastic bag, right? So marginal, when you use the term marginal, why this term marginal has to be introduced? It is because uh, in this intervention, we are not completely stopping the production of the negative externality good. Means in this approach, in the market economy framework, when we see that, again take the same example of a car polluting the environment, we don't say that okay, so we just stop producing cars. What we would say that let us limit the number of cars. And by when we say that we want to limit the number of cars, we have to introduce a term called as marginal cost, right? So when I'm saying marginal private cost of car production, it means that suppose a factory is producing 100 cars, and if it wants to produce an additional car, then at what cost that additional car has to be produced? So that becomes what could be called as marginal private cost for that additional car. And now what would be the marginal social cost of that? So when 100 cars are operating, and 100 cars would pollute something, it would pollute, and might cause an adverse health impact on the people in the society. So if the 101 car is introduced, then the it is going to impact one more person, one more person, or it might impact, impact the society. That additional car is going to impact the society, not one more person. The additional car is going to impact the society. So when you say that additional car is going to impact that society, it is going to create more pollution. That if you give some cost to it, that becomes the marginal uh, marginal externality cost. If that marginal externality cost has to be added to the marginal private cost, it becomes the marginal social cost. So marginal social cost would be, in a way, an additional of marginal private cost plus the additional cost of mitigating the negative externality, right? So these concepts are very useful. So it is not simply enough to talk about the total social cost or the total private cost. It is equally important for us to understand this concept of marginal private cost and marginal social cost. So we'll continue with this discussion on externalities and how do you account for these externalities in our next lecture also. Hi friends, the last few lectures we are concentrating our attention on externalities, and we are trying to figure out how this externalities is affecting the market. Uh, a very interesting impact of externalities on the market would be understood with the help of two diagrams which I'm going to show you. uh, Whenever there is a difference between the private cost and social cost, we say there is an externality. Or if there is a difference between a private benefit and social benefit, there is an externality, right? Now, what happens because of this externality? How does it change the market outcome? We know that the market outcome is discovered by the demand and supply forces in a market economy, right? So when we consider only the private cost and the private benefit, uh, the private cost and private benefit would give us a particular market equilibrium, right? Similarly, if we account for externality, we expect that the market equilibrium would change. So, what exactly happens if there is a negative externality? How does the market equilibrium change? If there is a negative externality, we would find that a negative externality results in a overproduction of negative goods, overproduction of polluting goods. This would be explained to you with the help of graph shortly. Similarly, if there is a positive externality, that results in the underproduction of goods. When I'm saying overproduction of goods, I mean overproduction with reference to what is socially desirable number of goods to be produced, right? So if there is a negative externality, what we find is the number of goods, polluting goods produced is more than what is socially desirable. And if there is a positive externality, the number of goods or services produced is less than what is actually, what is desirable to be produced. Let us understand this with the help of some graphs. So what you find over here is a market equilibrium graph, which shows what happens with the negative externality. So what you find over here is on the x-axis there is a demand for the quantities which is being produced, some goods. It could be goods or it could be services. And the y-axis would reflect the price or cost. So you see that there are three different colors I have used here. One blue color curve, what you see over here, is labeled as D, and that is a demand curve, right? As a demand curve, and this demand curve is basically reflecting both the private demand and social demand. Uh, there is a supply curve, which is the quantity of goods which are being supplied in the market. Let us say that the quantity of goods which are supplied in the market, they are polluting goods. For example, let us say that there is a production of cars, right? So car is, let us say, the quantity of cars is the product. So now if we take the example of cars, the quantity which I have shown here on the x-axis would reflect the number of cars which are being produced, right? And the y-axis would reflect the cost of producing that car, right? So when I'm, if you look at the supply curve, which is at the private cost, marginal private cost, we would find that the marginal private cost curve meets the demand curve or marginal benefit private benefit curve at point A. So at point A, you have an equilibrium, right? So this equilibrium, which is denoted by point A, is obtained by the intersection of the demand curve, which is reflecting the private marginal private benefit, and the supply curve, which is reflecting the marginal private cost. So the marginal private cost and marginal private benefit curves, they would intersect at point A, and there the supply and demand curves where they are intersecting at point A would give you an equilibrium output QA, means QA number of cars would be produced, and those would be available at an equilibrium price of PA. Now we know that when you talk about the private cost of production, it means that that private cost is not accounting for the damages which are caused to due to the pollution from the cars, right? And that those damages are to the third party. So if we internalize those damages, or if you monetize those damages, quantify those damages as an external cost, then add it to the marginal private cost, you would expect that the cost, the desirable cost of production of the car would be higher than the private cost, right? So you see here a green curve which I have shown, which is above the red curve, right? The red curve would show you the production or supply at the private cost, and the green curve would show you the supply at the social cost, right? So the marginal social curve is above the marginal private curve. So now, when you account for the negative externality, and if you want to have a efficient outcome, now efficient in the sense that it is taking care of the negative externality, right? So if you want to achieve that economically efficient, socially desirable output, then we need to consider the point where the marginal social cost is equal to the marginal social benefit. Okay, so the marginal social benefit curve, which is D, intersects the marginal social cost curve, and that intersection point is now a new point B. So what you find now is a shifting of the equilibrium output from A to B, and the number of goods which are produced is now less than QA. So the new quantity which would be produced, when we consider the marginal social cost, or when you consider the negative externality, you'll get the new quantity which is QB, which is less than QA. So as I was saying, that whenever there is a negative externality, it results in the overproduction of the goods. So if you neglect the negative externality, then you see that the negative externality cost, then you find that the market is producing it is overproducing the polluting goods. That means QA is the quantity which is not desirable, it is being overproduced, right? And the desirable quantity which has to be produced, is QB. And how do we get QB? So we got QB by accounting for the costs of pollution in my example, right? So wherever the marginal social cost becomes equal to the marginal social benefit, that point is the point of socially efficient output. In our case, it is the point B, and the socially efficient, economically efficient output is QB, right? So this is how we have internalized the negative externality. And this overproduction, what happens because of this overproduction? If we were producing QA instead of QB, that results in the loss of welfare or loss to the environment, which can be captured by a term called as dead weight loss. So that dead weight loss is a triangle which is A, B, and C is not shown here, but if you consider this triangle formed by the intersection of MSC and MPC line, right, with the demand curve, that triangle is called as a dead weight loss triangle, right? And it is a cost, okay, it is a loss of welfare or loss of environment because of overproduction from QB to QA, right? So if you shift that QA to QB, that dead weight loss becomes zero, right? How do you do that? That is done by what is known as Pigovian subsidy, that we will discuss later. Okay, so I hope that you have understood how equilibrium with negative externality can be represented graphically, and what is dead weight loss, right? Similarly, if we talk about representing the positive externality on a graph and understand the positive externality, the what happens because of positive externality, again this graph becomes very handy. The same graph where you have the quantity on the x-axis, the quantity of goods or quantity of services produced on the x-axis, and the prices, the marginal prices on the y-axis. So if you consider the demand purely from the private benefit perspective, right? Benefit perspective. So the demand, if it is reflected by only the marginal private benefit, then that gives you the blue line here. So the blue line is the demand line, but it considers only the marginal private benefit, the benefit only to the consumers of those positive externality, and it does not quantify the positive externality to the society, positive benefit to the society, right? So if you consider that as a demand curve, the blue line, and if you consider the supply curve, which would reflect the private cost, marginal private cost, right? The supply curve at the marginal private cost would intersect the demand curve, which is the marginal private benefit curve, and you would get a equilibrium point A and the equilibrium output QA. But that equilibrium output QA, right, is not the socially desirable output. Why is that not the socially desirable output? Because we are considering a case of positive externality. We say that if if there is a positive externality, then it's not simply the stakeholders, that is the buyer and seller, which is going to benefit. It is also going to benefit the society at large. Hence we need to, and hence we need to make sure that there is enough production. But here you find that there is an underproduction. Instead of QB, the market is producing only QA number of socially desirable goods. What could be the socially desirable goods? Let us say vaccines. If you are considering vaccines as the positive externality good, right, you will find that only QA number of vaccines are produced and administered to the people, right? But we know that vaccines are having positive externality. If you supply more vaccines, then it is going to benefit the society at large. So what we need to do is that then we need, if you account for that positive externality, the marginal social benefit would be greater than the marginal private benefit, and the curve, the demand curve, would shift upwards. So you see that there is a MSB curve, that is a marginal social benefit curve. And now this marginal social benefit curve, a new demand curve, would intersect the same supply curve, and wherever this supply curve intersects the marginal social benefit curve, there we would say that the marginal social cost is equal to the marginal social benefit, and that becomes your optimum point. It is a economically efficient, socially desirable optimum point. So that you see here in this case is QB, which is greater than QA. So once you account for positive externality, right, that would give us a new quantity QB, and if you don't account for that, that would result in the underproduction of positive externality goods, like in this case QA. So what happens if there is a production of QA instead of QB? The desirable is QB, but if you are producing only QA by neglecting the benefit of positive externality, then you get what is known as a dead weight loss. So which is shown in pink over here, right? So the dead weight loss is a loss to the people because of underproduction of positive goods, right? So I guess that you have understood that positive externality results in the underproduction of positive goods, and that leads to the dead weight loss. Similarly, you also now know that negative externality results in the overproduction of polluting goods, and that also results in the dead weight loss. Okay, so the aim should be to make the dead weight loss zero. Okay, so how do you do that? That we will discuss by studying what is known as Pigovian subsidies. Friends, let me discuss the concept of market failure in the context of externalities. The key concept is that prices don't capture all the costs. And why is that so? That is because of externalities. We have discussed a lot about positive externalities and negative externalities, and one thing becomes clear to us that if left to market forces, it means if left to the prices which are discovered in the market, uh, the outcome is not always socially desirable, right? So it means prices would not always capture the cost. So if prices do not capture the cost, and that is because of externalities, we need to understand what exactly happens. Why is the prices resulting in the distortion of market, or why is the market not giving us the socially desirable outcome, right? So in order to understand that why the market is failing, we need to look at these three graphs. This graph one, the graph A, which is a graph showing the quantity of goods produced or supplied by the market, on the x-axis, and on the y-axis there are prices or the cost of production. We see there are two curves or two lines. One is the supply line and other is the demand line, right? So supply and demand, wherever they meet, okay, wherever the supply line and the demand line meet, that is called as the market equilibrium. So considering that the supply by the producer is purely based on the private cost, and we had discussed what is a private cost, and the demand is purely based on the private value. We had also discussed what is private benefit. By private cost, we do not consider the social or environmental implications of the supply, and by the private benefit, we do not consider the social or environmental benefits or costs, right? So wherever this supply and demand curve meet, considering only the private cost and private benefit, that comes the point of equilibrium, right? And at that equilibrium, let us say that Q market is the quantity which is supplied by the market forces. Now, what we know for sure, and after the long discussion on externalities, we know that in case of negative externality, right, the quantity which is supplied by the market is not optimum, because uh, the supply does not consider the costs, the external costs, because of negative externalities, right? So we had said that, and you look at the second curve. If you look at the second curve, what becomes clear to us is that the social value, right, the social cost would be over and above the private cost, right? So the as you see the green curve, which is above the blue curve, that reflects the social value and or the social costs, which are above the private costs, and the difference is the external cost, and the external cost is because of negative externality, right? So when you shift that supply curve above to the social curve, it would give us a new intersection point with the demand curve. So now the social value curve or the social cost curve would intersect with the demand curve or the private benefit curve, and there is a new point which is shown here as Q optimum, right? So here you see that Q optimum is the quantity which is produced and which is less than the Q market. Now, what does that mean, right? And why is the Q optimum less? So, when we talk about negative externalities, we had taken an example of polluting cars, right? So, if you understand this concept or the graph with the example of polluting cars, let us say that say 100 cars are being produced by the market without actually accounting for the pollution it is causing, right? So those 100 cars are, we would say, they are overproduced. They are overproduced because they would be polluting more, right? But if you consider the external cost because of pollution and make the supplier pay that cost, what would happen is the supplier would produce less number of cars, let us say 80, and that in so in this case the Q market would be 100 cars and Q optimum would be 80 cars, and that 20, the savings of 20 cars, the less number of production of 20 cars would result in environmental benefit. So this is how the equilibrium shifts if you consider the external costs, and we say that in the presence of negative externalities, the production is always an overproduction, right? Because why there is overproduction? Because the prices do not reflect the social cost. Same could be said about the positive externality. In case of positive externality, we say that because of positive externality, there is a underproduction. Now, when you talk about positive externality, we had taken an example of vaccines. Let us say that there is a company, there is a firm which produces vaccines, and the vaccines which are being produced, that quantity, if left to the market forces, would be Q market. So, if you see the third graph, you see that Q market at equilibrium would reflect the number of vaccines which are being produced without considering the external benefit, because you know that vaccines are going to benefit the society at large, right? And this Q market is the quantity which is actually less. Let us say that the number of vaccines produced are 50, right? So Q market is 50. Now this Q 50 quantity, how has it been discovered? It has been discovered at an equilibrium point, which is the intersection of, as you see in the graph, the supply curve based on the private cost and the demand curve based on the private benefit, right? So that gives us the Q market. Now that Q market of 50 vaccines is actually not benefiting a lot to the society. So if you want to get a better outcome by considering the positive externality of vaccination, then we need to incentivize the production and make sure that uh, the demand curve shifts upwards. So when you see the demand curve, which is marked in red, shifting upwards, that gives us the social benefit, and that social benefit is actually the private benefit plus the external benefit. So when that shifts, you get a new optimum, a new Q, and that is called as a Q optimum. Let us say that it is 75 vaccines. So from 50 vaccines to 75 vaccines, when the society has moved, when the production has shifted, that has happened if we consider the social value. So considering the social value or the social benefit, which is going to happen because of a positive externality, the society has to actually produce more. So, in absence of positive externality, actually, if you don't account for positive externality, the society would produce only Q market, that is, it would underproduce. And in the presence of, if you put the external benefit into account, then what is the optimum? The optimum has to be more than what the market is going to produce. So this way we understand how the market equilibrium shifts to a socially optimum value if we consider the negative externality and positive externality. Bye for now.